I just wanted to make this aware to the community, or this design doc. It's been authored by Maciej, who has been a big contributor to Marquez, but is now focusing on OpenLineage. And Julian, one of the contributors with Benji, who's on the call. But the main idea here is that we have multiple use cases for Marquez. If I go back to when we were originally developing Marquez at WeWork, we did have APIs that allowed you to register data sets and also register job metadata outside the context of a run. And if I go to the API, you can kind of see that. If I go data sets here, see how we've deprecated to create a data set. The big change here was to move towards completely adopting OpenLineage as a way to collect lineage metadata, and that includes the data sets and also the jobs that were within the context of a run. But that run metadata is really one lineage view. We call it run level. We call it a run level lineage graph. There is now the need to define OpenLineage standard as maybe V2, or sort of maybe extending it to support defining data sets and jobs outside the context of a run. So that's where we have more static lineage, or really how would Marquez begin to define lineage outside the context of a run? Because that run ID is really important for us to version metadata. So if we go here, the run itself is probably the most critical part of how Marquez manages its versioning. So we know the input and output dataset versions that are associated with a run. We also know the job version that that run, or in this case, used to produce output datasets. So you're able to track that, and it's really core to how Marquez applies versioning, the versioning function. What this would mean if we begin to discuss static lineage is really you remove job version away, you remove the run, and also the dataset version. So really you're just left with a relationship between dataset and job, and no version associated with that. So there are implications to that model, but they should be viewed differently. I think there's strong use cases for both. One use case that we see in what we were building at WeWork was just scraping databases. So if you have data sets, or in this case, tables in Snowflake, you can go out and just have some cron or some scraper that says, give me the table information and let me post that to the Marquez backend. Before we were using the REST API, now it would be the lineage event. Oops. There we go. So just for some context there, I do want to point out the objectives real quick. Dataset that submit from OpenLineage is absent of a run event, and that's kind of what I elaborated on. It's outside the context of a run, and really what's contained within that event itself. Do we define dataset event, job events, and here you could see we also want to capture the job metadata as well. So that would include the facets that we have now, with source location and other metadata that you'd like to attach. And this is the more critical part for us. And for Marquez, we are a consumer of OpenLineage events. So what are the implications, and how do we manage processing different events that no longer have the run ID? And the doc does go into the use cases as well, which I'm happy to go into, but I just want to make sure that we go to the proposed model. Let's see, extensions. There's some discussions happening here, but I want to go back. I want to go just so others can see what this would look like. We would still use JSON schema, so that doesn't change. Here you'd have a dataset event, and you'd have the schema. I'm sorry, no, not the schema here. Where's the dataset itself, which represents a data set. And that would have the schema and other facets that we would attach. And then same thing for a job. You'd have a job event, and inside there you'd contain the job metadata. The more interesting thing for me on the consumer side is how would then, so with the job event itself, you would have to have the inputs and outputs. Marquez would have to know what inputs and outputs should be associated with the job. So they'll be predefined, and then we can build that lineage graph. But there needs to be this other level of lineage where we're not using run level metadata. So there's two jobs themselves. In terms of maybe I'll just stop there. Julian, yeah, I'm not going to go too deep in this, but Julian, I'm sure I missed some things, but this is just me.
I had a question. I had a comment. Can you go back to your original Marquez model diagram? Right.
This one here.
So I just wanted to say, in my opinion, there's still job versions and dataset versions, right? Like the only thing that is not touched in this graph is the run, right? And if we look at this, I wonder, I think I can annotate on your screen and just show something. Maybe not. Oh, that's fine. Oh yeah, here it is. Right, so we have two level of graph in here. Right here, this is the run level lineage, right? It keeps track of a job version, a run for a given job version, right, from a dataset and road to a dataset. So it keeps a run level lineage, right? So that's what we've been doing with, there's a query running, that particular instance of the query read this version of the dataset and wrote that version of the dataset. And you can keep track if the schema of the dataset changes and so on. Now, if I here, the other graph we have is the static graph, right? Like, which is like the current, usually it is inferred from the run level graph, right? We keep track of a given job is in this current version is reading from a dataset and writing to a dataset. So in the case of static lineage, we would update this layer, right? So if I clear, you would still have this information being updated. And in particular, because when you update a new static facet for a dataset, for example, you may change the schema, so you get a new dataset version. You still know what schema it was before. And for a job version, let's say we have a job and we know that the lineage for that job has changed. Now it's reading from a new table. It would still update its version, and we know that this job is reading from this. Right?
Yeah, I agree with that, Julian. It's just that's not current. It's not how it works anymore. The job versions are only created when a job successfully completes or fails. So we ended up introducing these temp inputs and outputs. So when you have an instance of a run and it completes and finishes, that's when job versions are created. What this ends up doing, or if we want to keep job versions around as the metadata changes, it goes back to the original logic that we had before. So anytime inputs and output change or the job location changes, you now have versions.
Yeah, but see, and you know, I kind of wanted to mention this when you were talking about the changes to like that job event, right? I think you can have job versions, and especially explicitly defined job versions, without like and kind of decoupling that logic about you know, defining a job version based on its inputs and outputs. For example, right, like one of the things that I would really love to see would be like a CI or CD integration where you publish a new version of your code, you know, you deploy to production, and it just reports the job version information, right? Like rather than having to have access to, for example, like the Git SHA or something like that at runtime to say like, this is the version of the code, right? Like, why not just deploy, like, why not just report that at deployment time? And then if you have that integration, right, maybe your CI or your CD pipeline doesn't actually have information to what the inputs and outputs of that job are, right? And so why burden the CD pipeline with that information when really the only thing it needs to know is what's the version of the code that's being deployed? And so if you can report that information, and then when the job runs, you can actually see its inputs and outputs. At that point, you can just say, hey, I know that this is the running version of the code. And here are the inputs and the outputs. And I feel like it's kind of similar to the dataset version stuff that we talked about with Ryan Hatter some time ago, right? If the database itself tells you this is the version ID, right? Like, for example, if you're using Iceberg or something where there are version numbers or version identifiers for a data set, like just use the identifier that's reported to you by the database, or use the version information that's reported to you by the job deployment pipeline. And then you can augment it with information like the inputs and the outputs. And in many cases, right, maybe you don't have that explicitly defined version, and then you can fall back on, oh, the schema changed, so we're going to change the version, or we know that a write happens to this data set, so we're going to like come up with a new data set version, or the job information changed, so we're going to come up with a new version information. But if it's explicitly defined, use the explicitly defined version, and then otherwise you can kind of fall back.
I agree. Oh, yeah, I think it's proposal challenge. But so yeah, I do remember this conversation that we had with Ryan, right? So there's also going to be two modes of Marquez, or that's what we discussed here, where you can explicitly provide the version and Marquez will use that, versus implicit. So a lot of what in the design of the versioning, we just wanted to remove the bottleneck, or it's just like that hurdle to start version metadata, and Marquez has its own implementation behind the scenes, but we should make it explicit. We should define a Marquez facet, or if we want this to be part of the core OpenLineage, it's like, hey, here's a job version ID that you should be using, and then same thing for data sets. And once Marquez knows that, oh wait, this is now being managed external, it will begin to look at that facet to say, oh, has the version changed, rather than more of an implicit version logic, which this proposal goes into a little bit. But yeah, there's definitely some discussion that needs to be had there. I'm glad that you brought that up, Mike. I think that's really important. Yeah, just the follow-up I had on it. But yeah, I just want to bring that to everyone's attention. I kind of lost where the doc is. Here it is. Highly recommend, for those that want to leave feedback, the discussion is pretty active, and it's worth giving a review on seeing where the standard might go. This does have implications for Marquez and also consumers in general, and how, whether we manage backwards compatibility or we just do a clean break from the standard. There's a lot of pros and cons there, but now's a good time to give that feedback. I know, Julian, there's no set date exactly for when we want feedback in, but the sooner the better. That's really.
I think, yeah, so we're going to get some more feedback at the meetup next week, and I think we want to accelerate a bit the discussion. So I had added some other use cases in there, but I think we decided we'll move it to a separate document, because it's like it's engine spec, but it's not. So the part that is in suggestion, I put in suggestion in the doc. I'll move it to a different doc to not pollute that conversation.
Okay.
Personally, I would want to get this moving relatively soon. We can say months or something.
Okay, great. Yeah, the doc is free, or I'm not. I mean, it's anyone can access it and anyone can leave comments. So I did post it in the channel. The Zoom chat, but I'll also post this in the Slack channel after this meeting.